Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As a few more people trickle in, I just want to take some time to welcome you to today's webinar. Today, we're going to have a great discussion on board governance, but before we get started, and to start us off in a good way, I'm going to invite Doug Harris to welcome us all and open us up today. Doug?
Hi, Kerry. Hi, CM. Hi, Square CM. Wait. Good day, everyone. Just to be mindful to acknowledge everyone for everyone's time today. And acknowledge everyone in their traditional territories. Again, Heights Epka. Aintha, Doug Harris, Qualmochsne Talhuilam. That's Tumenis Tamo, Sakmin. My name is Doug Harris. My traditional name is Talhuilam. I'm from the Stumanis First Nations. I live in the territory of Thukmin. It's been First Nations housing and infrastructural way to start off in a good way and provide an opening prayer. Avasiem. Stehst sia wenst, siem nesalchwan, na siya. Na elish watlaqua heights at the quasielip a ton of quail I yardsels titi watsels. Tita siem ni haichka, tita siem a ton of quail. Tita siem ni tihwam ni almas at the aish squalling. Tita siem ni hawkwish at an atama squalling, a ton of quail. Tamux quail. Startlamster. Siem. Haichka siem.
Thank you so much, Doug, for opening us up in a good way today. Very much appreciated. So welcome all. My name is Kerry Black and I am a civil engineer. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about board governance, but it's not going to be me speaking. We have a special guest who's going to be sharing their perspectives. Before we get into that, let me start by sharing a few perspectives on where we're at right now. And before I do that, some of you are joining our webinar for the first time, so important that you understand a little bit about how it works here. We've got at the bottom of your screen a raise hand function, a Q&A function. So at the bottom of the screen there, you should be able to see that option. We're going to encourage you to ask your questions through the Q&A function. If you're having difficulty with the Q&A function, you're also welcome to use the chat function. So any issues that come up, feel free to use those two things. If you're having audio issues, that is something that you may have to resolve on your own, but probably if you are, you can't hear me anyways right now, so I won't be able to help you with that. But if you have any other issues that you want to flag, feel free to put those down into the chat. We've got a few people helping us on the back end of this webinar today. I want to thank you for joining us today, a Tuesday after a long weekend, which I don't know about the rest of you, but I struggled remembering that today was a Tuesday. And so just getting back into the swing of things. So thank you for joining and making time. You may recall that FNHIC has hosted many webinars in the past, and many of those have covered a variety of topics that we've tried to explore to help stimulate and foster discussion at the regional level. Today is no different. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the people of Treaty 7 here in southern Alberta. Although many of you are joining us from BC, I acknowledge the territories that you're calling in from today. It's a pleasure to be able to host this this discussion, but the focus is really on our speaker today, Jamie Sterritt, who I will be passing over to in just a second. After today's webinar, we discuss board engagement and board governance and structure. We will be following up in each of our BC regions to talk about your perspectives on board governance. Many of you would recall in our earlier engagement sessions, we talked a lot about what does the board governance of a new housing and infrastructure authority need to look like, or what should it look like? And recognizing at that point that there's quite a diversity of perspectives and thoughts on exactly this topic. And so we want to be able to have a fulsome discussion, but to do that, we need to kind of understand that basic information. So joining us today is Jamie Sterritt. Before Jamie gets started on his presentation, I do want to invite Jamie to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself. So first of all, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate having you here today. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about who you are and where you're joining us from?
Thanks, Kerry. Really appreciate that, and thanks for inviting me in today. So I'm Jamie Sterritt. I come from the Gitxsan Nation in northern British Columbia. My traditional name is Winugum Zawingit. I come from the Luckaboo Wolf Clan and the House of Kleamlaha. I am coming today from the traditional territories of the Secwepemc, Tecumseh to Secwepemc people in Kamloops. I've been living here about 16 years. And I do governance work with First Nations communities across BC and Manitoba. So I come in and I do roles and responsibilities training with board of directors or chief and council, and policy development, strategic planning, those type of things, anything at that governance level. I carry on the work of my late father, Neil John Sterritt, who did this work for 20 something odd years, and mentored under him for a number of years, and have now taken over that business and trying to fill those moccasins the best I can. Super happy to be here today and discuss board governance, board engagement, but some of the best practices. By no means is this cut in stone, but it gives you guys some thoughts and some opportunities to speak of. So thank you very much, Kerry.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Really appreciate it. So yeah, Jamie's going to share perspectives on board structure and governance and what a board should do and potentially what a board should not do. And this is especially important in our discussions around housing and infrastructure, which many of you know gets quite heated and debated at times. And it is a difficult portfolio to manage across the country and across BC First Nations. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. Why, you may ask? For those of you who are maybe new to our organization, FNHIC has been tasked with helping to create a new housing and infrastructure authority. And much of that work has led us to a discussion around what the board that governs this new authority should look like. And we have heard a lot, and we'll talk about that a little bit after this. But first, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie to give us a little bit of an overview on key topics on board governance, what a board is, what they do, and some of the other pieces. And then we'll open up to the floor for conversation and questions. So Jamie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. So I've put together a bit of a slide deck to help follow along for the conversation. I think it's really important that we have a good understanding of what governance is from a board perspective, why we need that strong governance at that level, and some of the best practices, do's and don'ts, that sort of thing. So first of all, just quickly, what is the board of directors? So typically it's a group of people who jointly oversee the activities of your organization. It's the governing body. They have a practical, legal, and ethical duty that include ensuring proper oversight for your organization and making sure they enable the organization to move consistently forward. And that's super important. Without this overall body, then our organizations generally don't move forward in the capacity that they could or should do. And the certain roles that the board takes on is instrumental in making sure our organizations are successful. The staff are obviously key to kind of carrying out the day-to-day tasks of what's going on. But if the board hasn't set that oversight and put all the different practices and frameworks and mechanisms in place, then our organizations typically falter. So what is the role of the board? And I like to break it down into kind of 4 key areas. There's a lot of different things under these 4 key areas, but there's 4 main areas that a board of directors should be operating in. And those are planning, leading, organizing, and monitoring. And if we can look at this as the board's role, then it can really help for our organizations to be successful. And that's super important because we want to be able to take a hold of our organizations, move them forward, and be super successful in kind of the implementation of these larger projects. So what do we mean by planning? The board needs to take a step back and figure out, where are we going and how are we going to get there? That includes our vision. What is the end result that we want to see 25, 30, 50 years down the road? What is that vision? And then importantly, what is our mission? And that's usually baked into a lot of our legal documents, our bylaws, our constitution, that sort of thing. But the board needs to be very explicit in what they mean by the mission. So what's our vision? What's our mission? The mission is, how are we going to get to our vision? We also want to establish values for our organization. This is super important because it's the foundation of the people that we bring in, the people that we partner with, our stakeholders. What are our values that we want to make sure we instill internally and externally? And that's very key. And then what are our goals and what are our priorities? And typically what you'll see is these are 3 to 5 year goals. We can't have 30, 40, 50 goals. We have to have a number of goals, 4 to 5, that we can accomplish and then set those new goals. And then what are the priorities underneath this? And I think that's really important because if we don't set this foundational material, this foundational piece to our organizations, then our staff are just doing. And when anything pops up, we're reacting. We're not being proactive to where things are moving forward. And so it's very important that a board takes a step back and they actually do the planning work. Where are we going and how are we going to get there? Once we have that plan in place, then we can start to lead. And we're leading the organization. The board leads the whole organization, and they do this by making sure we have the right top manager. So we hire and we also evaluate that person on an annual basis. And that's really important because if we don't hire the right top manager, then are we going to get the work done that we need to get done? And that's super important. And another thing is that we aren't put in this place to administrate. We're put in this place to do the big governance work. So we hire the expert to be able to administrate our organization. And the board typically only has 1 employee, the top manager. Our organization might have 10, 15, 30, 100 employees, but we as the board only have 1 employee, and that is the top manager. And that's really important to understand because that means we're not getting into micromanaging and those type of things. We are giving direction to our top manager. Our top manager is then making sure that that information gets down to the appropriate staff. We do this also by developing that strategic plan, setting the vision, the mission, the goals, and the priorities. That's the guiding document that top manager takes away and is able to develop a budget and an operating plan around. So once we have that strategic plan in place, then we have to develop our operating plan. That includes the budget. That includes the resources, both human and financial, to get the tasks done. And it also has timelines and all the important information that the staff understand how we're going to actually do this on a daily basis. And then they can report back to the board on these separate things, linking it back to the strategic plan. So the board is not worrying about all the different actions that are happening day to day at your organization. We're able to come in, we do the planning work, we do our board meetings, and then we leave and go back to our communities. We go back and do our jobs. We go back and we can go on vacation because we know we've set this foundational information in place in order for our organization to succeed. And then we also have to make sure that we develop and implement policies. And policies are really important because they take politics out of our decisions. And this is where I see in the work that I do is really, really critical, because we get into political based decisions and then we get community members or we get members challenging the decisions we're making. And I think it's really important that if we have policies, we're not making those decisions, but we're creating a framework on how those decisions are made consistently and fair for everybody that we are working with. And that's really important as well. So we got to make sure that we have that budget in place, that operating plan. We got to make sure we develop and implement policies. We're not physically developing the policies. We're actually making sure that they come to our table. We work with them. When we're happy with them, by motion, we would adopt them, and then they'd be implemented by our top manager. So it's really important that we understand how we lead the organization. Once we've planned, we've led, then we have to organize. And we have to organize ourselves as a board. We come from all different areas. We come from different geographical locations. We come from different expertise. We come from different parts of the sector. And so we have to organize ourselves. So we do this by making sure we understand our roles and responsibilities. We have to select an executive, and that typically is part of, we have a chair, we'll have a vice chair, we may have a secretary and a treasurer, or a secretary treasurer. But typically the most important one in there is making sure we select the chair. That person is extremely important to the success of our board and the quality of our meetings, the quality of our work, the quality of the decisions that we make. So it's really important that we select the executive. We're starting to organize ourselves as a body. We have to utilize committees. We may be a smaller board, but we can bring committees in, and we'll talk about committees at the end, to do a lot of the kind of work that we can kind of do and bring recommendations back to us as a board. We can bring expertise in. So we don't have to have the board loaded with people or loaded with all the information that we need, because we can utilize committees for that. We have to run effective meetings. Almost 90% of the work that a board does is in a meeting. If those meetings are not effective, not efficient, they cost money at all times, people are going to start to get a little bit disorganized, or a little bit frustrated. They're not going to want to participate in meetings. They fail, and they maybe go too long. We don't start on time. We don't end on time. It all gets very frustrating. And then the actual level of commitment that our board members starts to decrease, or the decisions that we're making are potentially putting us personally or our organization at risk. And that's really important, that we have good, effective, and efficient meetings. We also want to have good communication. It's really important that we as a board communicate so that we all understand what's going on, what's happening, and all the different big picture things that are going on within our organization. A lot of times this is an area where I see it starting to break down. Maybe the chair knows 100% of what's going on, and board members maybe know 40%. Board members get frustrated because it feels like the chair is doing all the work or is setting all the direction. It's really important that we set up good communication skills, good communication practices amongst our board, so that we all feel part of the collective team. And so it's really important that we organize. So we've planned, we've led, we organize, and then we monitor. So what are we monitoring? Ourselves first and foremost. How effective are we? Are we participating at meetings? Are we showing up to meetings? Are we making good decisions? Are our meetings effective? How well is our top manager doing? Are they keeping on track? Are they reporting back to us? Are they actually following our vision and our mission and instilling our values? Are they actually reaching our goals and our priorities? Or are they running away and doing something totally different? And so we have to monitor this person, big picture. And if we don't have that plan in place, then it's really important that, or if we don't have that plan in place, it's really hard for us to monitor the top manager because we've never given them direction. So we have to give them direction. Budget is a big one. And operational plan, we have to monitor this. We have to understand the where our money's going and where the money's coming from. We have to understand this because that's where most of our risk and liability is. And then we monitor the strategic plan. Are we reaching our goals, our priorities, that sort of thing? I do see an answer or a question in the page. I'm just going to stop and answer that. Some of the communication practices I've seen, obviously we're using email and text. I like to say that we try and stick to one means, not the other. Informally, we can use text. Formally, we should use email because it's a track record of kind of what's going on. I think every board member should have an institution email address. So I might have an email address for my work. I might have a personal email address. And if I sat on a board, I might request a email address from that board because there's the Freedom of Information Act. If I have my personal information and my board information all in one email and they do a request for that, it opens up everything. So then all of a sudden now they have access to everything that's going on in my email if they're looking for that board stuff. The other thing is that when we leave the board, then the actual organization has a track record of all the decisions, all the conversations, all that sort of thing that happen at that board level. So we have corporate history, and I think that's really important. And then the last thing I've seen is just kind of a little interesting thing is inside communication when we're sending out emails, and then you can do this at your work or whatever, in the subject line, start to differentiate between emails that have to be answered and emails that are for information purposes only. So the one I like to use is 911 and 611. If I see 911 or if I use 911 in the subject line followed by the subject, then that comes into the board. I instantly see that 911 means I need to jump on that right now. So I go in, I answer it. If I see 611, then I can leave that. I can look at that another day. It's not critical to the risk or liability of the organization or a decision that has to be made or discussed. So that's the simple little thing that I've seen, because some of us get emails 20, 30, 40 a day, 100 a day. And if I have to look through all of those and I totally missed one in regards to my board work, then I could potentially be putting myself or the organization at risk. So if I see a 911, I'll just go straight to that one, answer it, and then I can get on with the rest of it. If I only see 611s, I'll just put those aside and get to them when I'm actually working. So those are some of the little communication things that I've seen. Just making sure we have good lines of communication, I think, is really important. Moving on. What are some of the things that a board does not do? A board should not administrate. Again, we're coming from all different areas. We're all coming from potentially maybe all different types of work, locations. So we shouldn't administrate. We've hired the top manager to administrate. We shouldn't micromanage. We shouldn't go around our top manager to micromanage. And we must not come to the board self-serving for ourselves or for our communities. We are here for the collective organization. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But it's really important that when you come onto a board, you understand that you do not administrate, you do not micromanage, and you do not come in with self-serving. I think everybody is super busy. I think everybody has full-time jobs and other things that they're doing. We want to minimize the amount of time that we spend at the board table, but still do the good work that you have to do. So choosing your board, I think, is really important. And I think this is where we get a lot of discussion around the table about how do we choose our board? What does that look like? So when we're choosing directors, ultimately, they're the fiduciaries of the organization. And in this essence, we should choose people who can uphold the typical 3 fiduciary responsibilities: the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. And as a fiduciary, basically you're held or founded in trust of other people's money or assets. So it's really important to understand that coming onto a board, assuming the role of a fiduciary, you also assume liability and risk and also want to be accountable. So there is legal areas to you being a board director within your organization. So breaking down these duties a little bit more, the duty of care. So directors should be able to actively participate in board activities. This includes planning sessions, meetings, sitting on committees. We want to have people that come to the table that have the time to participate. One caveat there is we want to make sure that the actual amount of participation is within what they can actually reasonably participate in. So we don't want to have a board meeting every 2 weeks. We may not even want to have a board meeting once a month. I sit on a number of provincial boards and a national board. We meet 4 times a year because all we do is plan, lead, organize, and monitor. We don't administrate, we don't micromanage, we do the big picture work. That allows people to be a little more available for these meetings if I know I only have to meet 4 times a year. If I had to meet once a month, I probably wouldn't be able to sit on the number of boards that I sit on because it would be just too much work preparing for those. We want to work collectively together to advance the mission and goals for all members. When we come to that board, we come as a collective body. I don't come looking out for my family. I don't come looking for my community. I come looking out for the collective body, and that's really important. And we really should be able to read and understand financial reports or are willing to build the skills in this area. It's really important to understand that underneath your duty of care, your biggest risk, your biggest liability comes on the financial side. If there's mismanagement of funds, if there's any of deceit, fraud, or theft, the organization is on the hook. And potentially sometimes if you breached your fiduciary duty, then you personally could be on the hook as well. So this is important to have this sort of skill or be willing to build that skill. And when I do my workshops, I'll actually ask how many people are comfortable reading a financial statement. And I might get 1 person in a board or 2 people in a chief and council that put up their hands. We start to rely on other people for the answers then, and that's a risk because we don't know the values of those other people. And I think that's really important. The duty of loyalty. So when you come as a director, as I mentioned, you place the interests of the organization ahead of your own interests. You come and you're sitting there for this organization. In this essence, we must disclose any potential conflict of interest or real conflict of interest, perceived or sometimes the ones that are kind of get us into trouble. And we should not use this position as a board member for personal, commercial, or our specific community's gain. You're chosen because of your expertise. You're chosen because of the knowledge that you bring to the table, whether that be housing, whether that be finance, whether that be legal, whether that be governance. You were chosen for a specific reason. So you leave your loyalty to your community, to yourself behind when you come to that table, and you're there in the best interest of the organization. And that's really important. And then the last one, the duty of obedience. So we have to make sure that our organization abides by all applicable laws and regulations. We want to make sure we don't engage in illegal or unauthorized activities. And we want to make sure that the mission that we set through that planning process is in accordance with the purpose identified in our bylaws and constitution or our legal documents, depending on how we're set up. And that's really important. We can't differ from what's in those legal documents because they are actually the ones that give us our guidance moving forward. So it's really important that we understand the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And so those are your fiduciary obligations as a board member. When we're looking at directors, they also should be experts in specific areas that can help the organization succeed. We don't need everybody to be an expert in housing to sit on that board. That's really important because we want people that have financial background. We want people that have legal background, governance background, knowledge keeper background, housing background. We want to have a diverse set of people with complementary skills so that when we're making decisions, we're getting the best possible information. We're having the best possible conversations. If everybody's an expert in housing, then we're typically going to look more to administrative type decisions. But if we're starting to get people that are complementary, they're diverse in their skills, then we're starting to get those big, good discussions and those good decisions moving forward. The director should be curious and willing to challenge your organization to strive to be its best. We don't want to just be in status quo. We always want to be curious. We want to always be willing to challenge what we're doing and where we're going in a positive impact. And they should be passionate and committed. When we're attracting board members and directors, we need to have that commitment because we meet, we make decisions. And if we're having certain people that can't make those meetings, that's going to be very tough and a potential risk in our governance structure. It's a good practice to establish a board skills matrix that actually tracks all these different things around your director's skills: governance expertise, communications expertise, marketing expertise, legal expertise, all these different financial expertise, so that we know how our board looks. And then when we're attracting new board members, we can go to that and say, okay, well, so-and-so is leaving. They have really strong financial skills. We need to attract a financial person to come into that role. That way we're being proactive in how strong our board is. Sometimes we don't have that luxury. Sometimes it's political representation that comes to our boards. So one thing that I try to talk about is that if we have political representation on our boards, it can sometimes be a big struggle. Lots of times chief and council wear multiple hats. They're extremely busy and they may not be able to fully commit. They find it hard to remove that political hat and put on that board hat at that table. So some of the topics, the discussions that we get into could be a greater chance of being political. A lot of times, or all the time, chief and councils are based on community elections. They could be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, different election schedules. So we have no control over the term of a council member who is a director. If they're 2 years, they come on, they're 2 years, they're not successful on their next chief and council, then we have to fill that director position, or they bring a new person in. We have to get caught up. We have to bring that person up to speed. And then in 2 years, it could be the same thing. We want to make sure that we have as much of flexibility, and I don't like to use the word control, but that's what it is, around who's coming to our table, how long they're there, what skills they bring. And if you are going to look at political representation that sits as the directors, we must look at those political people that can remove that chief hat or council hat and put on their director hat, because it comes back to those fiduciary duties again. Board size is always an interesting thing. A lot of times we have these massive boards, 14, 15, 17 people. We should have a board that's manageable. There's no really set number for optimum size of what a board should be. We don't even have kind of a set whether it should be odd or even numbers. Larger numbers have a lot of challenges in terms of effectiveness and meaningful individual participation. If we have a board of 19, typically quorum is 50% plus one, and quorum is the minimum number of people we need at the table in a duly convened meeting to carry out business. So if we have a board of 19 and we have 50% plus one, we need 10 people at that table to carry out business. Those 10 people are living their lives, they're working full time, so it's really hard for them to come to that table. Also, sometimes you don't get as much effectiveness. And what we're seeing in the governance world is smaller boards typically are more collaborative. We have a lot more conversation, a lot more communication. We challenge each other, and they outperform larger boards. I recommend anywhere from 7 to 9 is a good number. 7, 8, 9, I think is a good number, because if we're able to set it up in a way where everybody's coming to the table to represent the greater good, then we're attracting good people to the table and we're able to kind of do good business. We're able to kind of work through these different things. So that's really important, looking at board size as well. And I see a lot of time that we actually get these massive boards, and they just quickly we're like, okay, well, we have to reduce the number. We can't get quorum, those type of things. So we struggle a lot. So it's very important we look at board size as we move forward. We also need to look at the recruitment process. Sorry for the spelling mistake. I just saw that. The process of recruiting directors is critical. It can make or break our governance. Board should have a role in the selection of future directors. I think that's really important that we as the board have a role in who's coming to our table. We need to be able to look at the current gaps in our board skills or the people that are leaving and choose people with the qualifications and experience to fill those positions. We are proactive in our approach, leads to success of our organization. How we do that, whether through election or appointment, really doesn't make a big difference, but elected members generally go through a formal process to get selected. So sometimes at the AGM, we can set up different practices to bring those people kind of to that table, but sometimes those can get political. The appointed side can be twofold. One of them is we can appoint people. So we bring people in, we look at the board skills matrix, we look at what kind of skills we're looking at, we get people to apply for the board, and then we go through a formal process at the board to kind of say, okay, well, let's appoint this person. The other process I see is when chief and council appoint a board member. Again, we come back to a political position. They may not look at the board matrix. They may not look at who is going to be, what kind of gaps need to be filled. And they're just going to send someone in and say, okay, you're sitting on the board of this organization. They come in, maybe they don't have interest. Maybe they don't have the necessary skills that you guys are looking for. And they potentially could be a liability or risk within the organization. Again, a new chief and council comes in, they appoint someone totally different. We have no control. And that is an issue within our boards. And I see it all the time. Sometimes it's hard to get away from, but it's something if you're setting up an organization to be very careful in having good discussion around. Honorariums are also another thing that I always see kind of a big issue within boards and governance. We should be able to compensate directors for the time if the budget's available. Sometimes budget's not available. So I think this isn't a full-time job, so those honorariums should be reasonable. However, sometimes we only get people that will commit if there's an honorarium. So are we attracting the best people to the table? Or do we want people that want to be at the table and the honorarium is just a bonus? So those are things to kind of consider. If you are looking at honorariums, they should be fair and equitable. And there should be a best practice to have an honorarium policy. That clearly outlines what honorariums are, what they, how you can collect them, where you collect them, that sort of thing. And everybody around the board, it's fair, equitable, and consistent as you move forward. So honorariums are always an interesting thing. Sometimes I just see that this is the only thing people will sit on a board for is that, do I get an honorarium? First question they ask. And if that's the first question they're asking, typically I would say, then maybe their areas that they want to be on this board are not kind of in line with where the organization wants to go. They may be, but if that's the first question, then typically that's what I see within the work that I do. So as I mentioned at the beginning, committees are an important part of organizing ourselves, organizing our organization. And so committee is basically a body of one or more persons. They act on certain matters too complex for a larger group or outside the expertise of the larger group. So I know there's been discussions about youth committee, elders committee, those type of things. You could have a chiefs committee, those type of things. These are all good if they're set up properly. They should be doing useful, needed work. So it's very important that we take a step back and say, what's the role of this committee? Why do we need this committee? What's the benefit it's going to bring to the board, to the organization? And are they acting in the best interest of the organization? I've seen them also where we've had these committees start to run away and they just kind of carry on their own life. And so we got to be very cognizant from a board level that we got to make sure we provide a framework for them to operate in. What authority does a committee have? They typically have no authority because they have no liability. Any decision a committee makes, liability comes back to the body that created it, the board of directors. So they typically report or recommend back to the body that created it. They can have powers to act on specific instructions and take the necessary steps to get that job done, but the liability comes back to the board. So if you give the committee authority, you say, hey, you guys can do this, they do that, they make a wrong decision, there's potentially deceit, fraud, theft, that liability comes back to the board. There are obviously legal ways to kind of navigate your way through it, but generally the liability comes back to the board, who is the organization. So it's really important that if we're looking at committees, we put a lot of thought around what is the committee, what's it going to do, what's the purpose, and what can they not do? And that's really important. There's some advantages to committees. They're smaller groups that can meet more easily. They're typically better informed because we can attract the right people to that committee to give us those recommendations from a board perspective. They're typically less informal than a board because there's no liability. There's no risk at the decisions because they're providing recommendations. There's typically fewer distractions as well because they're focused on one certain area. The board is looking at overall everything, but a committee can come in and they can look at just a specific area. So what is that area? Why are you bringing them in? Let's say we have a finance committee. All they're focused on is finance. They're not worried about what's happening in marketing or what's happening in human resources. They're only worried about the finances and providing a recommendation back to the board. So that's really important. There's typically more privacy as well because we're bringing the people into a committee. They're not being brought in externally or appointed externally. They're being worked or appointed and put in by the board. So you can pick and choose who these people are typically. And it's a great place for youth and newcomers to develop leadership skills and tools without that liability. So I think that's really important, as well as that we need to develop our future leaders. And this is a great place to be able to do that with no liability. They participate in meetings, they prepare for meetings, they make those recommendations, they get all those skills they need. So if they come onto a board or come on to chief and council, they're already coming in ingrained with good governance background. And I think that's really important. Every committee should have a terms of reference, and I always recommend that you develop a blanket terms of reference for any committee that's struck under your organization. And if a new committee is struck, they have to fill it out. How many members? What is the composition? And how do we select those members? What are the roles and what are the tasks that they are to accomplish? Where and how often do they meet? What day does the report do? And what sort of support is needed? Human, financial, equipment. Again, we don't want them to think that they have this unlimited budget so that they have, maybe they get honorariums at the committee meeting and they're just meeting every week because they want to collect that honorarium. I've seen it. And at the end of the year, they have this massive budget that was not approved by the governing body. So you want to make sure that your terms of reference clearly outlines all these different things. That's the framework you're providing to that committee in order for them to do that work. And then you're monitoring how they're doing. So it's really important that this is all put in place. All too often, I work with organizations, chief and councils, where they have committees, no terms of reference. Committees don't even really know what they're supposed to do. So they're just doing whatever they want to do. And typically it turns into administration. And that's something that's really important, is that they are not here to administrate. They're here to provide recommendations back to the body that created it. So typically this is your standard organizational chart. We have our members. You'll see a dotted line to the board of directors because the members linked to the board of directors is not a formal one. It's a, they help put the board of directors in place and then we report back to them. The board of directors is the governing body. We make policy above that red line. And then underneath that red line, we implement policy. So we have our top manager, our executive director, our CAO, whatever we want to call that person. And they oversee the program managers who oversee the staff members. And I think that's really important that we understand that this is your standard organizational chart. It's the hierarchy. So I know as a staff member, I can't go directly to the top manager. I can go through my program manager and then I get to the top manager, but I can't go around that person to get to the top manager. Typically also the top manager won't go around that program manager to tell a staff member what to do. We follow that hierarchy. And then same as the board of directors, you can see there's no lines going to anyone but the top manager. So that's how we get our information, our direction down to the organization. And so if we can stick within something like this for our organizational chart, everybody's aware of what's going on. And this is a very simple one, but it's one that typically works. And then committees are basically a dotted line between the board of directors, if that's where they're created. And that means that there's an informal relationship. They provide recommendations back to that body, but they don't know any way. It's not typically a solid line because it's more of an informal and there's no liability there. So this is your typical standard organizational chart, something that your organization, as it grows, as it starts to be implemented, will look to develop and adapt. Your members could kind of come into something totally different. And I know you guys are talking about your governance structure and how that's going to work out there in all of BC. But once you kind of figure that, then your board of directors and everything out of that just flows down nicely. I will stop there. Thank you. Might have gone a little bit over time, but hopefully that worked out well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jamie, for that presentation. Super insightful and informative. I want to remind everyone that's listening that while HIC is the organization that's hosting this webinar, we're really having this discussion to talk about what the board structure of a new housing and infrastructure authority should look like. So it's not about this organization right now, more so about what we're creating. And when you're creating a new organization, that's when you have the opportunity to infuse a lot of these best practices or shared practices. So that's our goal with this discussion. Over the past 2 years, just as a reminder to our listeners, the discussions that we've had at the community level, at the nation level around board governance have centered around who should be on the board, how big the board should be, what they should be able to make decisions about, and also dispelling some common misconceptions about the who part of who should sit on the board. So if you have a board of governors for a housing infrastructure authority, does everybody on the board need to be a housing and infrastructure expert? And so there's a couple of pieces that we can go to, but before I maybe ask my own personal selfish questions, there is a question from Sophia in the Q&A, which is around communication practices. And I'm going to assume, Sophia, and you're welcome to type into the chat or Q&A if you want to clarify any more, but this is what are the communications practices that you have seen work best for the board of directors? And it's twofold: communication within the board, and then I guess communication from or outside, so internal versus external communications. Maybe speak to some of that if you feel you can, Jamie. And Sophia, if you want to clarify that question, feel free to go ahead. Jamie?
Yeah, I touched on a lot of kind of the internal communication from the board, kind of in the body of the presentation. And so I think from an external perspective, the board should really have strong communication plan around what that looks like. How are we going to get out to our members what we as the board collectively are doing? It's not me as a council or a director. It's not me as the chair. I typically like to see it come from a board perspective. So there's all the information that the organization is doing, but then what is the board doing? And that's also regards to, let's get our strategic plan out there. And typically from a strategic plan perspective, from the board, I like to see 2 pages, 4 pages, highly visible, very graphically heavy, just outlining our vision, our mission, our goals, and our priorities. The operating plan is where we get into all those kind of details of what's going on, but that's a marketing tool, a communication tool that you can get out to your members, and then you can report back to them big picture on what you're doing and that sort of thing. So I think I talked a lot about the internal stuff, but that's kind of some of the external opportunities.
Awesome, thanks. One of the pieces that we've had a lot of discussion about over the past few years is who should be on the board of governors for something like a housing and infrastructure authority. So the first one is, and it's in your slides, a little bit about what the kinds of skill sets that you require on a board. But if you are an organization that's tasked with housing and infrastructure in BC First Nations, does everybody on the board need to be an expert in housing and infrastructure? Do you want to talk a little bit about that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, the bottom line, no. And I think it's really important that we aren't experts in housing, because then we really get into the administrative side of what's going on. So if our executive director is doing something, then we're very specific in regards, well, that's not really the way you should do it because this happens in housing. If we have a well-rounded, diverse set of skills around that board table, everybody's going to be looking at this from a different perspective, from a legal perspective, a governance perspective, financial perspective, all these different things that we want to bring. We can have cultural people. They'll be looking at it from a cultural perspective. But if everyone that's coming out of that housing field, then all we're going to be doing is looking at that from typically from a housing perspective. Two kind of thoughts on that. I did some work with a fisheries organization, and they wanted all fishermen on the board. Fishermen, fisherwomen on the board. And so they did it. And what they found that they were getting into was, it was all just kind of, I did this when I was fishing, so this is what we should do here. And so they weren't getting that well-rounded conversation they needed to have make decisions. I sit on the board for Creative BC, which is kind of film and radio and music and all that for all of BC. I know nothing about that stuff, but I come in as a governance expert. And so that's what I bring to the table. And so I find a lot of the people that are industry specific on that board get into the details of the industry when we're making decisions. And I take a step back and say, no, we got to look at the governance perspective. Again, we have our fiduciary duties, and that's really important. So I strongly recommend that no, we don't have everybody as an expert in housing sitting on the board.
Thanks for that, Jamie. One of the pieces that we asked a couple of years ago, we went around and asked nations and to give their perspective on who they thought should be part of the governance structure. And part of the governance structure was a very open-ended, loose question. So part of the structure in some advisory way, but not necessarily on the board. So we talked about a technical advisory council. So those would be people so deeply ingrained in housing and infrastructure practices. They would have an advisory role. And one of the other one was the Elders and Youth Council that we spoke about. And one as well was a role for elected leadership in some way, shape, or form. Now, it was a little bit all over the place with respect to that, many feeling that we should have an advisory role for leadership, but not involvement directly in the Board of Governors. Others felt completely split, but if I could, I'll share with you a slide here, and this is good for the audience as well. This was one of the results that we had from our earlier engagement, which was what should the role of leadership be? And you see sort of the skew of answers that we got here. So many people, split on whether the leadership should have a role in the Board of Governors directly. So we see it, some not even wanting to answer that question because it's a tough one to answer. And then many people feeling a bit more comfortable with leadership having a role on some sort of advisory committee of some kind. And then some people still maybe, grappling with the question of no role whatsoever. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to what you've seen, in the BC or First Nations context on this piece. Is there a role for elected leadership in an advisory capacity? And the example I'll give is the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, where they had a lot of these similar conversations and then ended up having leadership represented on their Board of Governors for many reasons, but it went back and forth a lot with exactly these issues. What have you seen, and would you recommend as sort of best practices in this space?
Well, there's a couple different things, and I touched on in my presentation, is typically leaders are very busy. So if they are playing a role in regards to actual board of directors, a lot of times we're going to find that they actually have other things that are happening. A lot of times last minute, they're being requested to speak or be at another meeting or something's happening. So we want to get people that at the table that can actually be committed. We also want to make sure when people come into that board room, that director's room, that they can actually take off their hat they're currently wearing, whether it's a housing manager, whether it's a financial person, whether it's a chief in council, and put on their board hat and look after the organization. There's organizations out there where the chiefs have a lot of kind of opportunities for that kind of advisory type stuff. And that's things like First Nations Summit, the Leadership Council, the Summit Floor. And maybe there's a relationship there that this organization could bring those political type requests or advocacy type requests to that. But typically from this, we're looking at the organizations, we're looking at all First Nations here in BC, potentially 203. We're not going to get 203 political people around the table. We definitely don't want that. We see organizations out there where they have 119 board members. Doesn't work. But I think what we need to do is figure out what's that relationship and why are we trying to attract them to that table. I see it gets very kind of concerning when we have these advisory committees, because chief and council then, or political bodies then, want to get involved in the day-to-day operations, or they want to get involved in what the board's doing. And I think this board needs to be standalone. Councils and committees, youth council, elders committees, they can bring a lot of weight to kind of the decisions and stuff that are making, but keeping it very hands off from each of the individual communities, and then kind of looking at those processes. So I think advisory committees or councils, whatever you want to talk them, are important, but we need to kind of discuss what's that role. I doubt that you would see a lot of participation from a kind of a leadership council, because they already have the summit floor and that sort of thing. So maybe some sort of relationship or opportunity to bring those things that need to be brought to that advocacy or political role through that, or through kind of the communities up to chief and council and back out there. So.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, I know you covered it well in your presentation, but since it's something that comes up pretty much in every discussion that we have around this topic, I thought I'd explore it a little bit more. I want to close off today just first off by thanking you for the really insightful presentation, and to inform our attendees and participants that this is not the first conversation we've had around board governance, and certainly won't be the last. So over the next few weeks, we will be reaching out to you through HIC's regional engagement coordinators. That is Marilyn, Johnny, Doug Harris, and Beverly Smith. They represent our on-the-ground community participants who will really be reaching out to you to find a time to have this discussion in more detail. What's happening where you're located, and what are you concerned about? What are your questions, and what would you like to see from a new board governance structure for a new authority? But before we do that, I want to first just thank Jamie for your time today and your insightful presentation and all the information that you shared today, Jamie.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. If you want more information, you can head on over to the fnhic-bc.ca website, where you'll find more information, including a recording of today's webinar once we're able to post that up. I thank Doug Harris again for opening this up today in a good way. And stay tuned for more discussions on this topic as the weeks come. We round off today by thanking you for your time and giving you 2 minutes back to what is undoubtedly a very busy day for most of you. So thanks so much for joining, and we will be seeing you hopefully in person at some point soon. So thank you so much, and have a great day, everybody.